What's up, guys? Today is a very exciting episode. As most of you know, 993 Porsches and earlier, including the 964, is air-cooled. What does that mean? There's only oil in the car, there's no water, so oil acts as a lubricant and as a coolant. With this particular spec that was built by Spencer and Speed Sport Tuning, the engine has certain tolerances, so I need to have a very specific oil in there. That's about as much as I know about oil. So I called up my local distributor and I said, hey, can I come down and stick a camera in your face and sort of talk to a oil chemist and ask you a bunch of questions? And they agreed. So on today's episode, that's exactly what we're gonna do.
As some of you know, the 964 engine is a bit unique in that the original 3.6 liter was removed and larger 3.8 liter pistons and cylinders were installed a few years back. During this process, I learned how vital specific weight engine oil is to the engine's performance based on its displacement, its usage, environment, and of course, the build tolerances. Spencer was very specific about what oil I should use in my new engine and how often I need to change it based on my track schedule. Typically, I replace my oil and filter after 2,000 to 3,000 miles on the street or after every long race weekend at the track. Listen, oil is the blood of any car, but especially an oil-cooled one that's driven and tracked as hard as this one. So changing my oil on a militant-like schedule is very important to me, but what I wanted to understand is why my engine requires a special racing lubricant.
On your particular vehicle, what we've done is we took the factory tolerances from when the motor was first built, and we tried to mimic those because obviously the Germans designed it to have a relationship between the rocker and the face of the camshaft itself. And they designed specific oils back then for this type of steel on the cam and the rockers, as well as the piston rings and the cylinder walls. So what we try to do is use a special oil that was actually made back then that's hard to find now. In the racing application, it has the zinc that was available on the shelf back when this motor was originally built. So let me give you an example. The face of the camshaft itself and what we call the lobe, and here is a rocker. Certain applications have tappets, some have hydraulic lifters. This is a solid rocker assembly, and the two surfaces, if they were to ever touch each other dry, this motor would last about 60 seconds. So the film and the type of oil is very important that you use. The lubricity of the oil being able to stay on the surface after it slings itself off is important. On the rocker itself, you'll see this came out of a motor. It's a scrap right now because it's pitting. My guess it was probably poor oil that the customer might have used sometime years ago, but it started to wear and break the surface hardening of that rocker.
Now that I was officially freaked out about making sure my rockers don't pit from using the wrong oil for my particular engine, I'm heading out to New Jersey to visit one of the factories where my blend is created and to ask a lubricant chemist to help clear up some of my oil confusion. I'll be asking him a few questions that I, and it seems like most of the internet, debate online as to what is true and what may be somewhat blurry facts. I also want to be crystal clear for those of you eager to leave a comment that I'm a spokesperson or this is some sort of weird or clever way to sell oil. The truth is, I learned about Total because this is the oil my builder would stand behind. My engine, despite all of the flogging I've done to it, has never once been anything less than amazing with a consistent and predictable power band, so I'm a believer. It's that simple. I called them up, they picked up the phone, and I took advantage of seeing behind the curtain that I imagine any one of you would have done the same. And I thank Total for being so open and honest during my visit so I could share it with you, the viewer. Upon arrival, I checked in upstairs and read about the rules and regulations I was required to follow as a visitor before I met my hosts, Alex Dabrowski and Bernie Kordoleski. To be allowed into the factory, I needed to suit up like one of the village people for my safety, but I think they were more worried about me wandering off in pursuit of a tanker truck filled with my Spec oil that I could, borrow forever. Nonetheless, they were kind enough to give me the tour of the entire factory before we headed back to the lab where my questions could be answered. As you can see, this place was an intricate maze of pipes and holding units used for blending oil for automotive, industrial, and even food-grade uses. A place of particular interest to me was obviously the automotive blending department. Here, motor oil is transferred from large containers through small pipes into an automated filling machine. The empty bottles pass through a conveyor belt, they get filled up, then screw caps are torqued, and the bottle is fed back out and into a rotating tray that can be picked and packed into familiar boxes. Once all the boxes are full, they're stacked on pallets, wrapped in plastic, and loaded into an 18-wheeler so it can be delivered to places like Speed Sport Tuning. Kinda cool to see the distribution cycle from start to finish. On the second floor, Alex showed me the large mixing vats that were designed for food grade and non-food grade liquids. Basically huge blenders with spinning paddles that kind of look like boat propellers for optimal mixing of products and additives in large quantities. At the other end of Building 3 was a massive room just filled with empty 55-gallon drums that eventually make their way to the automotive shops around the world. Red for automotive, green for food grade, and blue for glass lubricants. These drums move on a downhill roller coaster type track system that runs from this room to every other building on campus to be filled from the larger vats that sit above them. To use it, someone loads the rails with empty drums, and they travel on thousands of rollers while chains pull them down the track system through a maze of turns until they reach their designated vat. After the plant tour was completed, it was now time to visit the plant's lab to see just how some of the testing is done to ensure the product's quality and weight is consistent for every batch produced, with a bunch of technical equipment that I was not allowed to touch. Likewise, for every batch of product produced, a sample is retained after testing in a special room that's numbered and labeled for future analysis.
So Alex, the blending facility was absolutely amazing. I'm like a kid in a candy store here. But before I put your feet to the fire with a bunch of questions, I think it's important to understand, a 10,000-foot view. I know that oil comes from the ground, but that's pretty much all I know, and it goes into these bottles somehow,
Right.
and then eventually goes into my car. So can you explain that process?
Sure. So you're definitely right. Oil does come from the ground, and what that type of oil is called is crude oil. The crude oil is then refined and distilled multiple times, and there are certain different cuts. So one of them is for gasoline, another cut's for diesel, and then there's another cut for lubricants in an oil that we refer to as base oil. So that's one component of a lubricant. And then the second one is lubricant additives. You basically mix the two together and you have yourself a basic lubricant.
All right, so there seems to be a lot of different categories. You have conventional, semi, full, and then racing, and it's a bit confusing. How do you, distinguish between all of them?
So the first type of oil is conventional. All it is pretty much just the base oil that comes from the ground and that's refined. Mm-hmm. And there are lubricant additives added to it. The next type is semi-synthetic, and this one has a varying range of synthetic oils added to base oil.
All over the forums, people are asking this question of what defines a semi-blend?
It's a great question, and unfortunately the answer is there is no definition.
Really?
So, for instance, one oil can have, say, 50% synthetic oil and 50% conventional, whereas another oil can still be called semi-synthetic and will only have 1% synthetic and 99% conventional oil.
So literally like an eyedropper of synthetic in there, that classifies as synthetic blend?
Yes. Now you have your full synthetics, which is completely synthetic base oil. Now racing is a specific engine oil category and typically have higher additive contents. And this one in particular actually has a very high zinc content, which is perfect for air-cooled cars such as yours.
So I know my engine takes specifically 2050. I know the engine builder built it, and that's the perfect oil for it. But I gotta be honest with you, all these numbers sort of mesh in my head. I don't know the difference between them. So how does a normal person decide, what's the right thing? What do these numbers mean, basically?
If you were living somewhere that was very cold,
Right.
you would want something that would have a very low first number, a low winter
So when
number.
you start up the car, you have a low number. That means, I'm guessing, it's thinner and it gets up.
Lubricates it quicker. And if you were in somewhere that was a warm climate, say like California or Arizona, you would want the second number to be higher because you want the oil to be thick enough so that it still will lubricate engine parts at a higher temperature. Because if the oil is too thin, then the oil won't lubricate any parts because it's just simply too thin, and then there'll be metal on metal contact with your engine parts.
So in theory, like if I used, a very cold weather oil or oil that's focused on cold weather, and I was in, a warm climate, I could
Right.
potentially do some damage to the engine, potentially, because
If you're not using the right oil,
Right.
correct.
Okay, so let's slow down a little bit here to really understand what all these numbers mean. To do that, a little background perspective is needed. When you see an oil bottle with two sets of numbers, it's called a multi-grade oil, meaning it's two types of grades in one bottle. Oil used to be defined by winter and summer grades that required the engine's owner to replace that oil's respective weight as the temperatures or the seasons changed, which is a huge pain in the butt. We don't need to do that anymore, but we need to make sure that our multi-grade oil is within our engine and environment's specifications. Okay, so let's take my oil for example. I use 20W50 Racing. For now, let's forget about the racing part of the blend and focus on the numbers so we can remember what they actually mean going forward. So what I've done in the past is I've broken this down into 3 steps that I do in my head every time I'm thinking about the differences in oil grades that may be helpful to you. So in my mind, I first draw an upside down T in between the 2 numbers of the multigrade like this. Now W is of course for winter or for cold startups, while the right side of this equation is for when the engine is hot or at operating temperature. Now the numbers on each of these sides is simply a measure of the viscosity, meaning how thick the oil is during those times, meaning cold and warm. So if the number is low, well, then you have a low viscosity during that time. If the number is high, then you have a high viscosity during that time. Okay, this part is probably going to get a few chemists and scientists, including my wife, a little angry, but here's how I think about it. Instead of viscosity, which is just a fancy big word, I remove viscosity and just replace it with thickness. So if you have a low number, that means you have less thickness. If you have a high number, that means you have more thickness. Again, that's very rudimentary and I'm sure it's wrong, but it works for me. Okay, for the third point, it's another simple thing to remember. As oil heats up, it thins out. Now, if you take the opposite of the converse of that, when it's cold, it's very thick. Just think about honey or syrup in the refrigerator. As you pull it out of the refrigerator, it doesn't flow very well when you tip it over, right? But if you microwave it, it flows much better. Again, not very scientific, but that's not the point. The point is to actually remember it in crunch time.
All right, another point of confusion with me is if you open up any hood of any car nowadays, you see the oil cap. The oil cap has a brand and it has a spec oil that you need to use in your car. So my question to you is, do you need to use that brand and that spec, or is that some sort of like marketing thing I don't know about?
The oil specification has to be exactly what's in the owner's manual. If you were driving an Audi or a Volkswagen and you open up your manual and it says use Volkswagen 502-505 approved engine oil. If you were driving a BMW, for instance, it would say use BMW Long Life 01 or use BMW LL01 approved engine oil.
All right, so if I understand this correctly, the brand is somewhat irrelevant. The spec is obviously super important. But my other question is, with respect to the specs, I see on a lot of oil cans, oil bottles says meets or exceeds. Is that a check mark? Am I good if I have that kind of oil?
It has to be an approved oil by the vehicle manufacturer. It has to have an approval that says BMW LL01 or Mercedes-Benz 229.5 approved engine oil.
All right, so there's a little bit more confusion that I have with my specific oil. I see 2050 synthetic, and then there's 2050 racing, which is what I use. Now, part of my brain goes, it says racing on it, so it makes me feel cool and warm and fuzzy, but is that an actual real thing, or is that some sort of marketing?
No, it's an actual real difference. So a racing oil typically will have a higher zinc content than a non-racing oil. And that's used to protect the engine parts at higher performance standards, so higher temperatures, more aggressive use out of your car.
Why is zinc used in my engine, and is it bad? Like, what's that whole point?
Well, in the newer model cars, there is an elevated amount of zinc in comparison to, say, a full synthetic engine oil. But in the newer models, you typically don't want to use too much zinc because you'll end up poisoning the catalytic converters. But in your case, for your car, you would want something with a higher zinc content because your car uses mechanical lifters.
So a very popular debate online is about additives.
Additives are useful. They're actually one of the more important components of an engine oil. There are a whole cocktail of additives that are used in the engine oil. They each have their own specific purpose, and they comprise a very significant portion of your engine oil. Additives are a real thing. They're not fairy dust or anything. They're a real portion of the engine oil.
What's the bottom line here for somebody that just wants their engine to run for 200, 300, 500,000 miles? What do they need to do to ensure that?
It's very simple. You go to your owner's manual, you open it up, you look at the oil specification and the drain interval. And as long as you follow that religiously, the engine will run just as smoothly as the vehicle manufacturer intended it to be.
So after a long day, here's what I learned. Crude oil coming from the ground is refined into a few different cuts: gas, diesel, and lubricants, to name just a few. Semi-synthetic oils can be any ratio of conventional to synthetic, and you can only get an idea of that blend percentage based on the price. Kind of imprecise if you ask me. The brand oil or the company name stamped on your oil cap is way less important than the actual specification of the oil recommended for your engine found in your owner's manual. Finally, additives are a real thing, and fully synthetic oils do have a longer drain interval than normal conventional oils. Now, with all that being said, the moral of the story is not as exciting as I'd hoped for. Instead, it's very basic. Read your owner's manual, put the exact spec oil it recommends, regardless of the brand, and change it regularly. Don't overthink it.
Today's been absolutely amazing, and I learned a ton about oil. As always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email at larry@ammonyc.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.